Chapter 1. The Bitter Taste of Irony. In the realm of Drios, the forest did more than breathe. It whispered, gossiped really, like an old crone with too many secrets and not enough lips to share them. The trees here were ancient, roots tangled in both the soil and the stories of those foolish enough to venture beneath their boughs. Circe, of course, was no fool, merely someone with a deep-rooted aversion to humanity. She stood on the creaking steps of her cottage, a quaint little structure, if you had a penchant for crumbling moss, and the occasional curious fox. Overhead, the sky bled into twilight, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her, as if even the dark couldn't resist her allure. Circe smirked at the thought. At least the shadows have some taste. The air was thick with the scent of herbs, lavender, sage, and something she couldn't quite place but suspected was either a rare medicinal plant or the decaying remains of a field mouse. Life in the forest wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. Peaceful, that is, until the heavy footfalls of an outsider shattered the silence. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of the man trudging up the narrow path to her cottage. He was a merchant, by the look of him, and not one of the desperate peasants she usually had the displeasure of turning away. His cloak was lined with fur, probably something rare and endangered, and his boots were polished to an irritating gleam. So that's what wealth buys you. Useless, shiny things. Circe sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Why did they always find her when she was finally starting to enjoy her solitude? The man reached the base of the steps, and Circe could feel his eyes on her, those eyes filled with fear and disgust. Ah, recognition. Perfect. Circe, the man began, his voice low and gravelly, probably from years of barking orders at the unfortunate souls who worked for him. I need your help. She cocked her head, leaning lazily against the doorframe. Let me guess. You've come to offer me a lifetime supply of stares, whispers, and half-baked apologies for treating me like dirt all these years. His brow furrowed, clearly not in the mood for pleasantries. My daughter is dying. Circe raised an eyebrow. Well, that escalated quickly. And this concerns me because... The man's eyes darted around the clearing as if he expected the trees themselves to offer him some divine intervention. They didn't. The forest had better things to do than get involved in human drama. Finally, he settled on her, his gaze hardening. You're the only one who can save her. She sighed, her fingers trailing absently over the vines that curled around her doorway. Funny. I could have sworn you merchants didn't associate with heretics like me, or was that just last week's town gossip? Chryses, because of course it had to be Chryses, leader of the merchant guild and a general pain in the ass, shifted uncomfortably. His face was drawn tight with desperation, and Circe could almost smell it on him, the scent of powerlessness wrapped in self-righteous indignation. Please. His voice cracked, and Circe's smirk wavered for a fraction of a second. Well, this was new. Chryses, the Chryses, grovelling at her door. She almost laughed. Almost. Fine, she said at last, pushing off the doorframe with a languid stretch. But it's going to cost you. And no, I don't want money. I'm sick of shiny coins. They don't buy me respect. She flicked her gaze to his polished boots. Or taste, apparently. Chryses looked like he'd swallowed something sour, but nodded anyway. Whatever you want. Her lips curled into a smile. Finally, something interesting. Inside her cottage, the air was thick with the scents of crushed herbs and dried flowers, the remnants of her latest concoctions strewn across the table. Shelves lined with jars of questionable liquids glistened in the low light, their contents shifting lazily, like something alive. Circe moved between them with practiced ease, grabbing a mortar and pestle before turning to face Chryses, who was too big for her small space and far too uncomfortable with being there. So, Circe began, grinding a handful of leaves into a fine powder. What exactly did little Miss Princess get herself into? Curse? Poison? Or did she simply overindulge on those overpriced pastries you nobles are so fond of? She's ill, Crisis muttered, his eyes fixed on a jar of what appeared to be a mummified rat. We don't know what's causing it. Of course you don't, she snorted. You people wouldn't know a curse if it danced naked in front of you. Let me guess, she's pale, weak, maybe can't see too well anymore. Crisis blinked. Yes, how did you... Cersei waved a hand dismissively. I've seen it before. Something nasty, no doubt. A curse like that doesn't just happen. Someone must have done something to piss off a sorcerer. Wouldn't be the first time one of you merchants thought you could cheat magic. Crisis stiffened. Hit a nerve, did I? And I'm supposed to clean up your mess? She shook her head with a mock sigh. Tragic, really. It's always the daughters who pay the price while their fathers play ignorant. His face twisted in frustration, but Cersei ignored it. She'd deal with his pride later. First, she needed to see what she was up against. I'll come with you, she said, much to his visible relief. But don't expect a miracle, and definitely don't expect me to be nice. I'm doing this for your daughter, not for you. As she gathered her supplies, Cersei couldn't help but feel a pang of something unfamiliar. Something that might have been sympathy, if she allowed herself to entertain the idea. But no, this was business. Just another job. And if she managed to save the girl, maybe, just maybe, she could finally prove that she was more than the monster they all thought her to be. With a final glance at her cottage, Cersei stepped out into the growing darkness. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she walked past, the air thick with a sense of impending change. Whatever awaited her on this journey, Cersei was ready. After all, it wasn't like she had anything better to do. The path leading out of the forest was choked with creeping vines and low-hanging branches, but Cersei knew every twist and turn like the back of her hand. Crisis, on the other hand, stumbled along behind her like a newborn fawn, cursing under his breath each time his foot caught on a root or his cloak snagged on a bramble. "Watch your step," Cersei called over her shoulder, not bothering to hide the smirk in her voice. "Wouldn't want you breaking an ankle before we even get started." Though, to be fair, that would save me a lot of trouble. Crisis didn't respond, but Cersei could hear the frustrated huff he made, like a man used to getting his way but suddenly finding himself at the mercy of someone he'd rather avoid. It was almost enough to make her feel sorry for him. Almost. At least he's learning what it feels like to be uncomfortable, she thought, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. Maybe by the end of this little adventure, he'll have developed a shred of humility. Doubtful, but one can hope. The forest thinned out eventually, giving way to rolling fields that stretched toward the distant silhouette of the castle town. The towers and turrets loomed over the horizon, bathed in the dying light of the setting sun, a stark reminder of the life Cersei had long since left behind. As they walked, Cersei couldn't help but wonder what kind of mess she was walking into. She'd dealt with curses before, nasty ones, subtle ones, even a few that were downright amusing in their twisted ingenuity. But something about this felt different. There was an air of inevitability, like the universe had decided to drop her right in the middle of a cosmic joke, and she wasn't entirely sure she liked being the punchline. "So," she said after a while, breaking the uneasy silence, "how long has your daughter been ill?" Crisis hesitated, and Cersei could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he tried to decide how much to reveal. Typical. These merchant types were always playing their cards close to the chest, even when their entire livelihood was at stake. "About a month," he finally admitted. "At first, we thought it was just exhaustion. She'd been preparing for her wedding," Cersei snorted. "Of course, a wedding. Because what's more exhausting than planning an event where you get to marry a stranger for the sake of political gain?" "It's a good match," Crisis said defensively, and Cersei had to resist the urge to roll her eyes. "Sure, I'm sure Count Hyperion is a real catch," she drawled. "Tall, dark, and magically charming, right? Let me guess. He's the strong, silent type who sweeps your daughter off her feet with promises of eternal devotion. I bet she was all starry-eyed and swooning until... Oh, wait, she started going blind." Crisis' jaw tightened, but he kept his focus straight ahead, refusing to take the bait. Cersei could almost respect that. Almost. "How do you know about him and the wedding?" asked Chises, his confusion and surprise almost comical. After all, an outcast like Cersei shouldn't have any clue about the inner workings of Castletown, much less the gossip of the elite. Cersei raised an eyebrow, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, you know, Chises, us degenerates have a secret underground newsletter. We exchange all the latest high society gossip between our bouts of exile and shunning. It's truly a wonder how we manage to keep up with you high-class folk." Chryses just shrugged and shook his head. "She was happy," he said quietly. And then she wasn't. Cersei's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something resembling curiosity. There was a crack in his voice, a crack that spoke of genuine fear and maybe even guilt. Interesting. "How bad is it?" she asked, her tone shifting just enough to show that she was paying attention now. "She can hardly see at all," Chryses replied, his voice low. "She's weak too, always tired. Some days she can barely get out of bed." Cersei frowned, her mind already ticking through the possibilities. Sounds like a curse, all right. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Slow, creeping, like a poison that doesn't just kill, it erodes. Chryses remained silent, and for the first time since this whole debacle began, Cersei allowed herself to feel a pang of unease. She didn't like puzzles she couldn't solve, and the more she thought about it, the more this curse felt like something beyond the usual petty grievances she dealt with in the town. "Who'd you piss off, Chryses?" she asked, not unkindly. He didn't answer right away, but the haunted look in his eyes spoke volumes. "I don't know," he said at last, though it sounded like a lie. "It could be anyone. In my position, enemies aren't exactly in short supply." "Helpful," Cersei muttered, but she let it drop. For now. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, night had fully fallen, and the streets were lit with the flickering glow of lanterns. Cersei pulled her hood up, hiding her face from the few townsfolk milling about. She wasn't in the mood for another round of whispered insults and suspicious glances. Tonight, she had bigger problems to deal with. Chryses led her through the winding streets, past the merchant district, and up to the towering mansion that served as his home. It was an ostentatious thing, large, gaudy, with too many windows and a front door that looked more like the entrance to a cathedral than a house. Cersei stifled a snort. Of course, nothing says I'm compensating for something like a house you could get lost in. The servants let them in without a word, though they shot Cersei a few uneasy glances as she swept past them. She didn't bother acknowledging them. People like that didn't matter. Not unless they had something useful to offer. They made their way up a grand staircase, the marble floors gleaming beneath their feet, and Cersei had to suppress a wave of irritation. Everything about this place was a reminder of why she stayed in the woods, away from all this opulence. It made her skin itch. Finally, they reached a set of heavy wooden doors at the end of a long hallway, and Chryses paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. "She's inside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Cersei nodded once. "Let's get this over with." He opened the door and Cersei stepped into the dimly lit room beyond. Selene lay in a grand canopy bed, the curtains drawn back to reveal her pale, fragile form. Her once vibrant hair was limp against the pillows, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality, like she was slowly fading out of existence. Even from across the room, Cersei could see the unnatural cloudiness in her eyes. Definitely a curse. Cersei's lips thinned and her fingers flexed instinctively, itching to get to work. But first, she needed to understand what she was dealing with. "Selene," Chryses whispered, moving to his daughter's side. His voice was soft, tender in a way Cersei hadn't expected. "I've brought help." Selene stirred at the sound of his voice, her eyes flickering open. For a moment her gaze wandered the room, unfocused, before finally settling on Cersei. "Who?" Her voice was barely a rasp, but Cersei heard it clear as day. "I'm the one who's going to fix you," Cersei said, stepping closer and giving her a crooked smile. Or at least I'm going to try. No promises. If I can't, well, I'm sure your father has a backup plan. Selene blinked slowly, clearly confused, and Cersei felt a strange pull in her chest. She looked so fragile. Not that she'd say it out loud, of course. Rest now, Cersei added, her voice softer than before. I've got work to do and it won't be pretty, but by the end of this we'll see if you're cursed or just really, really unlucky. As she set her bag down and began unpacking her tools, Cersei caught Selene's faint smile. Unlucky, Selene whispered, her voice tinged with dry humour. Story of my life, Cersei grinned. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all.